The millionaire paid for a coffee for the woman shortly after he saw her at his wife's grave, who had died 21 years ago. Upon hearing the reason, he immediately began to cry. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting stories like this one. The autumn wind whistled through the streets of Cambridge, carrying with it the familiar scent of rain and fallen leaves. Alexander Blackwood stood at the window of his study, watching as the grounds of his Victorian mansion transformed into a canvas of amber and gold. At 57, he had achieved everything society deemed worthy of success: a thriving investment firm, a magnificent estate, and more wealth than he could spend in several lifetimes. Yet, the enormity of his home only served to amplify the emptiness that had been his constant companion for the past 24 years. His fingers absently traced the edge of the silver frame on his desk, where Elizabeth's smile remained forever frozen in time. She had been gone for more than 2 decades, but her presence still lingered in every corner of their home. The way the morning light filtered through the stained glass windows was exactly as she had envisioned when they'd renovated. The rose garden, though meticulously maintained by the gardeners, would never quite capture the magic it held when she tended to it herself. Alexander adjusted his wool coat and grabbed his umbrella, maintaining his daily ritual of visiting Ashworth's, the local cafe that had been his morning sanctuary for years. The staff knew him well enough to have his preferred Earl Grey ready before he reached the counter, served in the distinctive blue china cups that reminded him of the set Elizabeth had collected. As he pushed open the heavy wooden door of the cafe, the warmth and aroma of freshly ground coffee embraced him like an old friend. Martha, the elderly barista who had worked there since before Elizabeth's passing, greeted him with her usual warm smile. "The usual, Mr. Blackwood?" He nodded, offering a small smile in return. "Thank you, Martha, and perhaps one of those almond croissants as well." His gaze drifted across the cafe, taking in the familiar scene of students from the nearby university buried in their laptops, young professionals hurriedly grabbing their morning coffee, and the occasional tourist admiring the cafe's Victorian architecture. That's when he saw her. A young woman stood at the counter, a sleeping infant strapped to her chest in a pale blue carrier. She was rummaging through her purse with increasing desperation, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment as she pulled out coins and counted them again. Her dark hair fell forward, partially obscuring her face, but there was something about her that made Alexander pause. Perhaps it was the gentle way she swayed, trying to keep the baby asleep, or the quiet dignity with which she handled her obvious distress. "I'm so sorry," he heard her say to Martha, her voice soft but clear. "I thought I had enough. I'll just take the formula then, not the coffee or pastries." Her accent suggested she wasn't local. There was a hint of Yorkshire in her words. Martha's face softened with sympathy, but business was business. The young woman began to return items from her small basket, each movement careful so as not to disturb the sleeping infant. Alexander found himself moving forward before he had consciously made the decision to do so. "Please," he said, stepping up to the counter. "Allow me." He pulled out his wallet, noting the surprise on the young woman's face as she turned to look at him. For a moment, he felt his breath catch in his throat. Her eyes, they were exactly the same shade of hazel as Elizabeth's had been. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly," she began to protest, but Alexander was already handing his card to Martha. "I insist," he said gently, "and please add whatever pastries you'd like as well. The chocolate croissants here are particularly good." He noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the slightly worn edges of her coat, signs of someone struggling but trying to maintain appearances. The young woman hesitated for a moment longer, before gratitude won out over pride. "Thank you," she said softly. "That's very kind of you. I'm Sophie Bennett." She shifted slightly, adjusting the sleeping infant. "And this is little Emily." "Alexander Blackwood," he introduced himself, watching as Martha efficiently packed up Sophie's original order along with additional pastries he'd suggested. "Would you care to join me? My usual table has a comfortable chair that might be better for you and Emily." Sophie seemed to consider the offer carefully, her eyes searching his face. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she nodded. "Yes, thank you. That would be lovely." As they settled into the corner table by the window, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about Sophie, something beyond just her eyes. Perhaps it was the way she carefully arranged her belongings, or the graceful movement of her hands as she checked on her sleeping daughter, gestures that stirred long dormant memories. The conversation flowed naturally, surprising them both. Sophie spoke of her recent move to Cambridge, her voice taking on a wistful quality as she mentioned searching for something, though she didn't elaborate. Alexander found himself sharing small stories about the cafe, about Cambridge's changing seasons, carefully skirting around the deeper waters of his own past. As the morning light strengthened and the cafe began to fill with the lunch crowd, Sophie gathered her things to leave. "Thank you again, Mr. Blackwood, for everything. Please call me Alexander," he replied, watching as she skillfully adjusted Emily's carrier. "And you're very welcome." It wasn't until after she had left that Alexander realized why their encounter had felt so significant. For the first time in 24 years, he had spent an entire morning without feeling the weight of his solitude. As he prepared to leave, Martha caught his eye and smiled knowingly. Sometimes, she seemed to suggest, the greatest changes begin with the smallest acts of kindness. What Alexander couldn't know as he watched Sophie disappear into the crowd outside was that this chance encounter would unravel a secret that had been buried for nearly 3 decades, a truth that would shake the very foundations of his carefully ordered world. The following morning dawned grey and misty, typical of Cambridge in late autumn. Alexander stood before the ornate gates of Milton Road Cemetery, clutching a bouquet of white roses, Elizabeth's favourite. This weekly pilgrimage had become as natural as breathing over the past 24 years. Each visit a quiet conversation with the woman who had been the centre of his world. The gravel crunched beneath his feet as he made his way along the familiar path, past ancient yew trees and weathered headstones. Elizabeth's final resting place lay in a peaceful corner, beneath the spreading branches of a copper beech tree she had always admired. As he approached, however, Alexander realized he wasn't alone. A figure stood before Elizabeth's gravestone, head bowed. Even through the morning mist, he recognized the blue baby carrier and dark hair from yesterday's cafe encounter. Sophie Bennett stood completely still, one hand resting on the granite marker, the other supporting her sleeping daughter. Alexander's footsteps faltered. In all these years, he had never encountered another visitor at Elizabeth's grave. The coincidence seemed too precise to be mere chance. Sophie must have heard him approach, for she turned, her eyes widening with recognition. "Mr. Blackwood, Alexander," she stammered, quickly wiping at her eyes. I can explain." He moved closer, noting the fresh flowers, purple irises, already placed at the base of the stone. "You knew Elizabeth?" The question came out barely above a whisper. Sophie's hand trembled as she reached into her bag, pulling out a worn envelope. "She was my mother," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "My biological mother." The roses slipped from Alexander's grasp, scattering across the damp grass. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as he stared at the young woman before him, suddenly seeing what his subconscious had recognized from the first moment. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile, the graceful way she held herself. All Elizabeth's. "That's not possible," he said, though even as the words left his mouth he knew they weren't true. "Elizabeth would have told me." Sophie held out the envelope, its edges softened with age. "I found this at the adoption agency in Yorkshire. She left it there for me, along with some legal documents. I was born in 1994, just before she married you. She wanted me to have a better life than she could provide at the time." Alexander's hands shook as he accepted the envelope. Inside was a letter written in Elizabeth's unmistakable elegant script, along with a photograph he had never seen before. A much younger Elizabeth holding a newborn baby, her face a mixture of love and heartbreak. "I've been searching for my biological parents for years," Sophie continued, gently swaying as Emily stirred in her carrier. "When I finally found the records and learned about Elizabeth, I was overjoyed, but—" She paused, emotion thick in her voice. "By then it was too late to meet her. I've been visiting her grave for the past few months, trying to feel some connection. Yesterday at the cafe, when you mentioned your name, I couldn't believe it. I'd seen it on the headstone so many times." Alexander found himself sinking onto a nearby bench, his mind racing through memories of their early marriage. Elizabeth had occasionally seemed distant, disappeared for hours without explanation, and kept a locked box in her dresser that he'd never questioned. After her passing, he'd found the box empty. "She never told me," he said softly, looking up at Sophie. But there were times, moments when she seemed to carry a great sadness. I always assumed it was because we couldn't have children of our own. He paused, a thought striking him. I have something that might help us confirm this. Elizabeth's hairbrush, I kept it, along with some of her other personal items, with a DNA test. Sophie nodded, tears flowing freely now. I'd like that. I mean, I know in my heart, but scientific confirmation would mean so much. Emily chose that moment to wake, her small whimpers breaking the emotional tension. Sophie quickly moved to comfort her, and Alexander watched in amazement as the baby settled at her mother's touch, just as he had seen Elizabeth calm crying children at various charity events over the years. Would you like to come back to the house? Alexander asked, suddenly desperate not to lose this unexpected connection to Elizabeth. We could talk more, and I could show you some photos of her that you might not have seen. Sophie's face lit up with a smile so like Elizabeth's that it made his heart ache. I'd like that very much. As they walked together through the cemetery, Alexander felt something shift inside him. The weight of solitude he had carried for so long seemed lighter somehow. Elizabeth had left him one final gift, a daughter he never knew he had, and a granddaughter who might help fill the silence of his empty house. What neither of them realized, as they made their way back to Alexander's car, was that this revelation was just the beginning. Elizabeth had left behind more than just a letter and a photograph. She had left a trail of breadcrumbs that would lead them to understanding why she had kept this secret for so long and how it connected to some of Cambridge's most prominent families. The Blackwood mansion stood like a sentinel against the darkening sky, its Victorian architecture a testament to Cambridge's rich history. As Alexander's car crunched along the circular driveway, he watched Sophie's expression in the rearview mirror. Her eyes widened at the sight of the house, taking in the ornate stonework and sprawling grounds that Elizabeth had once lovingly overseen. "This is where she lived," Sophie whispered, carefully unbuckling Emily from her car seat. "It's beautiful." "Elizabeth made it beautiful," Alexander replied, leading them up the stone steps to the grand entrance. "She transformed it from a cold, imposing structure into a home." He unlocked the heavy wooden door, gesturing them inside. Mrs. Harrison, the housekeeper who had served the family for 3 decades, appeared in the foyer. Her practiced professional expression faltered slightly at the sight of Sophie, her hand flying to her throat. "Oh my," she breathed, before quickly composing herself. "Good morning, sir. Shall I prepare tea in the conservatory?" Alexander nodded, noting Mrs. Harrison's reaction with interest. Had she recognized Elizabeth in Sophie's features as well? "Yes, please. And perhaps some of those small sandwiches. Miss Bennet and her daughter will be joining us." The conservatory had been Elizabeth's favorite room, its glass walls allowing natural light to flood the space, while offering views of the rose garden beyond. Sophie settled into a wicker chair, arranging Emily comfortably in her lap, while Alexander retrieved a leather-bound photo album from a nearby bookshelf. "Mrs. Harrison seemed surprised to see me," Sophie observed, accepting a cup of tea from the housekeeper, who lingered a moment longer than necessary before departing. Alexander sat across from her, opening the album. "I suspect she saw what I'm seeing now, how much you resemble Elizabeth." He turned the pages carefully until he found what he was looking for, a photograph of Elizabeth at Sophie's age, standing in this very conservatory. The resemblance was striking. Sophie leaned forward, studying the image intently. "When was this taken?" 1993, just before I met her. She was working as a curator at the Fitzwilliam Museum." Alexander paused, realizing this would have been around the time she was pregnant with Sophie. She loved art, had an incredible eye for detail. The museum's board practically begged her to stay on after we married. As they continued through the album, Alexander shared stories behind each photograph, filling in the gaps of Elizabeth's life that Sophie had never known. But it was when they reached the photos from their wedding that Sophie noticed something peculiar. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing to a woman standing slightly apart from the other guests, her expression serious despite the joyous occasion. "She seems to be watching Elizabeth rather than looking at the camera." Alexander frowned, studying the photograph more closely. Margaret Rothschild. She was a patron of the museum, quite influential in Cambridge society. Elizabeth worked closely with her on several exhibitions, but he trailed off, remembering something that had never seemed significant before. They had a falling out shortly after our wedding. Elizabeth never told me why. Sophie shifted Emily to her other knee, her expression thoughtful. The name Rothschild appears in my adoption papers. I always assumed it was just the name of the agency's lawyer, but maybe there's more to it? Before Alexander could respond, Mrs. Harrison entered with fresh tea and a concerned expression. "Sir, Lady Rothschild is here. She's asking to speak with you. She says it's urgent." Alexander and Sophie exchanged startled looks. After 24 years, Margaret Rothschild had chosen this exact moment to appear. It couldn't be coincidence. "Show her in, please," Alexander said, closing the photo album. To Sophie, he added quietly, "Perhaps we're about to get some answers." Margaret Rothschild swept into the conservatory like a winter wind, her silver hair immaculately styled and her posture rigid with purpose. She stopped abruptly at the sight of Sophie, all color draining from her face. "I see I'm too late," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth always said the truth would find its way out eventually. Alexander stood, positioning himself protectively between Margaret and Sophie. "What truth, Margaret? What do you know about all this?" Margaret sank into a nearby chair, her carefully maintained composure cracking. "I've kept Elizabeth's secret for nearly 30 years out of respect for her wishes. But when I heard rumors about a young woman visiting her grave, asking questions about the past," she looked directly at Sophie. "Your mother was one of the bravest people I ever knew, and everything she did out of love." Sophie cradled Emily closer, her voice trembling slightly. "Why did she give me up? The letter she left says she wanted a better life for me, but she was clearly well off, especially after marrying Alexander." "The letter tells only part of the story," Margaret replied, reaching into her handbag. "I've brought you the rest of it. Elizabeth made me promise to keep these safe until they were needed." She withdrew a bundle of letters, held together with a faded blue ribbon. "But before I give them to you, you need to understand something about the Cambridge of the early 1990s and about the Rothschild family's role in a scandal that Elizabeth helped to uncover." The air in the conservatory grew thick with tension as Margaret clutched the letters, years of buried secrets threatening to surface. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the rose garden, as if nature itself was preparing for revelations that would reshape their understanding of the past. The sound of rain against the conservatory's glass roof created a gentle backdrop as Margaret Rothschild carefully untied the blue ribbon holding Elizabeth's letters together. Emily had dozed off in Sophie's arms, peaceful and unaware of the weight of the moment unfolding around her. "In 1993, Margaret began, her aristocratic voice soft but clear, "the Fitzwilliam Museum received a collection of Renaissance paintings from an anonymous donor. Elizabeth, as junior curator, was assigned to authenticate them. What she discovered led her down a path that would change many lives, including her own." Alexander remembered that period, Elizabeth working late into the night, making mysterious phone calls, and keeping detailed notes in a journal he never found after her passing. "The paintings," he said slowly. "They were forgeries, weren't they?" Margaret nodded. "Excellent ones, but forgeries nonetheless." Elizabeth found discrepancies in the Providence documents. When she dug deeper, she uncovered a complex web of art fraud involving several prestigious Cambridge families, including my own husband. Sophie gasped softly, instinctively holding Emily closer. "What did my mother do?" "She came to me," Margaret replied, smoothing one of the letters with trembling fingers. "By then, she was already pregnant with you, Sophie. The stress of the investigation was taking its toll on her health. I was the museum's primary patron, and she trusted me. Together, we gathered evidence, but we knew that once the truth came out, there would be serious repercussions." Alexander leaned forward, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. "That's why she gave Sophie up for adoption. She was protecting her." "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "The families involved were powerful, vindictive. Elizabeth feared they would use any means necessary to silence her, including threatening her child. So she made the hardest decision a mother could make." She handed the first letter to Sophie. "She chose an adoption agency in Yorkshire, far from Cambridge's sphere of influence. Then she approached the families with a deal." Sophie unfolded the letter with shaking hands, her eyes scanning her mother's elegant handwriting. "What kind of deal?" "She would keep quiet about the extent of the fraud, allowing the families to quietly return the forgeries and replace them with legitimate artwork, avoiding public scandal. In return, they would ensure the museum implemented stricter authentication procedures and establish a fund for art restoration education. Margaret paused, her expression softening. And they would never attempt to find you. Alexander ran a hand through his silver hair, remembering the nights Elizabeth had cried in his arms, never explaining the source of her grief. But why didn't she tell me after we were married? Surely by then. The agreement included a binding clause of silence, Margaret explained. Elizabeth couldn't risk the truth coming out, not even to you, Alexander. She feared that any breach of the agreement would null the protection it provided for Sophie. Mrs. Harrison appeared quietly with fresh tea, her eyes red-rimmed. She had clearly been listening from the hallway, adding pieces to her own decades-long puzzle of serving the Blackwood household. Sophie was reading through the letters, tears falling freely. She writes about watching me from afar, visiting Yorkshire on her business trips just to catch glimpses of me at the children's home. She never stopped loving me. No, she never did, Margaret agreed. After her passing, I continued to monitor the situation, ensuring the agreement held. But times have changed. Most of the people involved have either passed away or left Cambridge. When I heard you were asking questions about Elizabeth, I knew it was finally time to bring the truth to light. Alexander moved to sit beside Sophie, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Elizabeth would be so proud of the woman you've become, of the mother you are to Emily. Sophie looked up from the letters, her expression a mirror of Elizabeth's determination. There's something I don't understand, Lady Rothschild. Why did my mother trust you with all this? You were part of the families involved. Margaret smiled sadly. Because I was also a mother who had to give up a child to protect them. Elizabeth and I shared that bond of sacrifice. She reached into her handbag once more, withdrawing a small velvet box. She left this for you as well. I've kept it safe all these years. Inside the box lay a delicate silver locket, its surface engraved with intricate roses. When Sophie opened it, she found a tiny photograph of Elizabeth holding her as a newborn, and opposite it, a modern photo of Sophie with Emily, clearly taken at the cemetery. How did you get this? Sophie whispered, touching the recent photo with trembling fingers. I've had someone keeping an eye on you since you first started visiting Elizabeth's grave, Margaret admitted. She would have wanted to know you were safe, that you had found happiness. She stood, smoothing her skirt. There's more to tell, more letters to read, but perhaps that's enough revelations for one day. As Margaret prepared to leave, the storm outside began to clear, sending rays of late afternoon sun through the conservatory glass. Emily stirred in Sophie's arms, blinking up at the adults around her with Elizabeth's hazel eyes. Alexander watched as Sophie showed her daughter the locket, explaining in soft tones about the grandmother she would never meet, but whose love had shaped their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. In that moment, he realized that his home, silent for so long, was finally filling with the kind of joy Elizabeth had always wanted for it. But as Margaret's car disappeared down the driveway, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were still more secrets to uncover, more threads of Elizabeth's past waiting to be unraveled. As twilight settled over Cambridge, Alexander found himself alone in his study, surrounded by the remnants of the day's revelations. Sophie had gone upstairs to settle Emily for the night in one of the guest rooms, insisting she felt too emotionally drained to drive home. The stack of Elizabeth's letters lay spread across his mahogany desk, each page filled with years of unspoken love and carefully guarded secrets. Mrs. Harrison knocked softly before entering with a tray of sandwiches. "You haven't eaten all day, sir," she said, setting down the tray. She hesitated, then added, "I always wondered why Mrs. Blackwood spent so much time in Yorkshire. She would return looking both happier and sadder, if that makes any sense." "It makes perfect sense now," Alexander replied, picking up one of the letters. "Did you suspect, Martha, about Sophie?" The housekeeper adjusted her apron, a habit she'd maintained through decades of service. "I had my suspicions, especially during those first years of your marriage. Mrs. Blackwood would sometimes stand in the nursery she'd decorated, just staring at the empty crib. I thought perhaps—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I thought perhaps she'd lost a child before meeting you." Alexander nodded, remembering how he'd found Elizabeth in that nursery countless times, her explanation always the same: she was simply dreaming of their future family. Now he understood she had been mourning the daughter she'd had to give up. "There's something else, sir," Mrs. Harrison said, pulling an envelope from her pocket. "After Mrs. Blackwood. After she left us, she gave me this with instructions to keep it safe until the right moment. I believe that moment has come." She placed the envelope on his desk with trembling hands. Inside, Alexander found a key and a hand-drawn map of the mansion's grounds, with an X marked near the old greenhouse. Elizabeth's handwriting noted, "For Sophie, when she finds her way home." "The greenhouse hasn't been opened since Mrs. Blackwood's garden party in 1997, Mrs. Harrison reminded him. "She had it locked up right after, said it needed repairs but never got around to it." A soft knock interrupted them. Sophie stood in the doorway, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, looking so much like Elizabeth that both Alexander and Mrs. Harrison caught their breath. "Emily's finally asleep," she said, then noticed the tension in the room. "What's wrong?" Alexander held up the key. "I believe your mother left something for you in the greenhouse. Would you like to see it now?" Despite the evening chill, they made their way across the grounds, flashlights casting long shadows across the overgrown path. The greenhouse stood like a crystal palace in the moonlight, its glass panes clouded with years of neglect. The key turned smoothly in the lock, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. Inside, the air was thick with the musty smell of abandoned dreams. Their flashlight beams revealed empty planters and dusty shelves, but it was the back wall that drew their attention. A large canvas hung there, covered by a sheet that had once been white but had yellowed with age. Together, they pulled the sheet away, releasing a cloud of dust that made them step back, coughing. As the dust settled, they found themselves staring at an enormous oil painting of a woman holding a baby, her face turned away from the viewer, looking out over a Yorkshire landscape. "It's us," Sophie whispered, reaching out to touch the canvas. "She painted us." Alexander recognized Elizabeth's artistic style immediately. She had painted as a hobby, but he'd never seen her complete anything of this size or complexity. The dedication in the corner read, "For my daughter, may you always know you were loved, 1997. "Look," Sophie said, pointing to a small brass plate attached to the bottom of the frame. "There's something engraved here." Alexander leaned closer, wiping away years of dust. "The truth lies in the roses." Mrs. Harrison gasped softly. "The rose garden, Mrs. Blackwood's private journals. She kept them buried beneath her favorite white rose bush. She said the thorns would protect her secrets until they were ready to bloom." As they hurried to the rose garden, Alexander couldn't help but wonder what other secrets Elizabeth had carefully planted, waiting for the right moment to flower. The roses, though dormant in the autumn air, seemed to whisper with his wife's voice, guiding them toward one more piece of the puzzle she had left behind. Sophie knelt beside the white rose bush, her fingers already searching the soft earth beneath it. The moonlight cast strange shadows through the bare branches, making the moment feel almost surreal. What they would find buried beneath those roses would change their understanding not just of Elizabeth's past, but of their own futures as well. The earth beneath the rose bush yielded easily, as if it too had been waiting for this moment. Sophie's fingers brushed against something solid, a small metal box, its surface etched with the same rose pattern as her locket. Mrs. Harrison quickly fetched a cloth to clean away the dirt, while Alexander held the flashlight steady. The box's lock clicked open with the same key that had opened the greenhouse, revealing a collection of small leather-bound journals, their pages crisp despite their earthen sanctuary. On top lay an envelope addressed simply, "For when the roses bloom again." Sophie's hands trembled as she opened the letter, Emily's soft cries echoing from an upstairs window where the baby monitor Mrs. Harrison carried crackled to life. "I should check on her," Sophie said, reluctant to leave this moment of discovery. "Let me," Mrs. Harrison offered, already moving toward the house. "This is where you need to be right now." Under the gentle glow of the garden lights, Sophie began to read aloud. "My dearest Sophie and Alexander, if you're reading this, then the truth has finally found its way into the light, like a rose pushing through winter soil. There is so much more to tell you both, and I've carried the weight of these secrets for far too long. The art fraud scandal was only part of the story. The real reason I had to protect Sophie goes deeper than forged paintings and family reputations. In my work at the museum, I discovered something that certain people would have done anything to keep hidden, evidence of an even greater deception involving stolen art from Jewish families during World War II. Margaret helped me protect this evidence, hiding it within the authentication documents of the forged paintings. It was our insurance policy, ensuring that those involved would honor our agreement. But it was never about the art. It was about justice for families who had lost everything. I've spent years tracing these artworks, creating a detailed record of their true provenance. The journals in this box contain everything I discovered, including the names of the rightful heirs. Margaret knows some of this, but not all. I couldn't risk putting everything in one place or telling one person the complete truth. Sophie, my darling daughter, your father was one of the researchers helping me track down these families. He disappeared shortly after I told him I was pregnant with you. I never knew if it was by choice or if something had happened to him, but I knew then that I had to protect you at any cost. Alexander, my beloved husband, forgive me for not sharing this burden with you. Your ignorance of these matters was your protection, and Sophie's. But you deserve to know that every moment of joy we shared was real, even when I carried these secrets. There's more you need to know, but it must be discovered gradually, in the right order. The first journal contains a key to understanding the rest. Read it together. The truth belongs to both of you now. With all my love, Elizabeth. Alexander sat heavily on the garden bench, his mind reeling. Your father. She never mentioned him to me. I always assumed that he'd abandoned her, Sophie finished, opening the first journal. But it seems he was trying to help make things right. She paused, studying a page of Elizabeth's careful notes. Look at this. She's listed several paintings currently hanging in Cambridge colleges, with their true ownership histories. From the house they could hear Emily's cries subsiding as Mrs. Harrison's gentle voice hummed a lullaby through the baby monitor. The familiar melody carried across the garden, a reminder that life's simplest moments continued even as long-buried truths emerged. We should bring these inside, Alexander said, noticing Sophie shiver in the night air. There's too much here to process in one night. As they gathered the journals, a photograph slipped from between the pages, a younger Elizabeth standing with a tall, dark-haired man in front of the Fitzwilliam Museum. On the back was written, Thomas and Elizabeth, Spring 1994. The man's eyes, Sophie realized with a start, were the same shade of brown as her own. Back in the warmth of the study, Mrs. Harrison had prepared fresh tea and arranged the journals chronologically on Alexander's desk. Emily's sound asleep, she reported. Poor dear's had quite an exciting day, even if she doesn't know it yet. Sophie traced her fingers over her mother's handwriting, feeling closer to Elizabeth than ever before. She left us a roadmap, she said quietly, not just to the truth about the art, but to our family's history. To who we really are. Alexander picked up the photograph of Elizabeth and Thomas, studying it carefully. We'll need Margaret's help to understand all of this. She's been protecting these secrets for as long as Elizabeth has. Actually, Mrs. Harrison interjected, there might be someone else who could help. Mrs. Blackwood used to correspond with a Professor Hammond at the university's art history department. I remember delivering letters to him several times in those early years. Sophie looked up sharply. Hammond? That name appears in these notes. Something about a private collection he helped authenticate. The pieces were beginning to align, forming a picture more complex and far-reaching than any of them had imagined. As they settled in to read the first journal, the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the house like a reminder that time, ever patient, had finally allowed these truths to surface. What none of them realized was that somewhere in Cambridge others were beginning to stir, disturbed by the ripples of their discoveries. The past, it seemed, was not content to remain quietly buried beneath the roses. Morning light filtered through the study's stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the spread of journals and documents that Sophie and Alexander had spent most of the night examining. Mrs. Harrison had insisted they try to rest, but sleep had proved elusive, as Elizabeth's words painted an increasingly complex picture of the past. Professor Hammond's office hours start at 9, Sophie said, glancing at her phone while gently rocking Emily in her carrier. We should be able to catch him before his first lecture. She had already called the university to confirm he still taught there, 30 years after his collaboration with Elizabeth. Alexander straightened his tie, a habit born of decades in the business world. Are you certain you want to pursue this, Sophie? Your mother went to extraordinary lengths to protect you from these revelations. She also left us these breadcrumbs to follow. Sophie pointed out, touching the silver locket at her throat. I think she knew someday I'd be ready to know the whole truth. And now with Emily, she looked down at her sleeping daughter. I need to know our family's full story. Mrs. Harrison entered with a breakfast tray, her expression concerned. There's something you should know before you leave, she said, setting down the tray. Last night, after you both finally went to rest, I received a phone call from Lady Rothschild's housekeeper. It seems she had an unexpected visitor late last night, Professor Hammond himself. Alexander and Sophie exchanged worried glances. That can't be a coincidence, Alexander said. Not after we discovered his connection to Elizabeth's investigations. No, Mrs. Harrison agreed. And there's more. The housekeeper said Lady Rothschild left immediately afterward, taking a large file with her. She mentioned something about securing the evidence. The morning suddenly felt less bright. Sophie carefully transferred Emily to the portable bassinet Mrs. Harrison had found in the attic. Elizabeth had bought it years ago, hoping someday it would be needed. We need to find Margaret before we see Hammond. Whatever's in that file might be crucial. Alexander was already reaching for his car keys when his phone chimed with a text message. The colour drained from his face as he read it. It's from Margaret. Meet me at the Fitzwilliam Museum. Elizabeth's old office, come alone. You can't go alone, Sophie protested, but Alexander was already shaking his head. Margaret's been protecting this secret for decades. If she says come alone, she has her reasons. He touched Sophie's shoulder gently. Stay here with Emily. Mrs. Harrison will help you continue going through the journals. I'll call as soon as I know anything. The Fitzwilliam Museum was quiet at this early hour, its grand entrance still closed to the public. Margaret waited by the staff door, her usual elegant composure marked by signs of a sleepless night. She led Alexander through familiar corridors to a small office that had remained largely unchanged since Elizabeth's time there. Hammond came to warn me, she said without preamble, closing the door. Someone accessed the old authentication records yesterday, specifically the files relating to the paintings Elizabeth flagged in 1994. She pulled a thick folder from her bag. These are copies of everything Elizabeth and I hid. The originals are safe, but what? Alexander, the paintings Elizabeth traced, they're being moved. Several of the colleges have suddenly decided to loan them to various museums around the world. Once they leave Cambridge, they'll be harder to track, Alexander finished, understanding dawning. Someone knows we're close to exposing the truth. Margaret nodded grimly. Hammond's been keeping tabs on these artworks for years. He was Elizabeth's main contact in the academic world, helping her document their true provenance. But even he doesn't know everything she discovered. She opened the folder, revealing photographs of paintings, detailed notes, and correspondence. Elizabeth created an elaborate system of cross-references. Each journal entry connects to specific documents, which in turn lead to other clues. She knew that if anything happened to her, the evidence needed to be undeniable. Alexander studied a photograph of a particular painting, a pastoral scene that had hung in one of Cambridge's most prestigious colleges for decades. According to Elizabeth's notes, it had originally belonged to a Jewish family in Vienna, stolen during the war and sold through a complex network of dealers and collectors. Sophie has her eyes, Margaret said softly, watching Alexander examine the documents. And her determination. Elizabeth would be proud to see her pursuing the truth like this. But worried sick about the risks, Alexander added, remembering his late wife's protective nature. Margaret, what aren't you telling me? Why did Hammond really come to warn you last night? Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she withdrew one final document from her bag. Because he recognized Sophie. He's been following her visits to Elizabeth's grave, trying to work up the courage to approach her. She passed the paper to Alexander. You see, Hammond knew Sophie's father. In fact, he was there the day Thomas disappeared. The document was a newspaper clipping from 1994, featuring a small article about a research assistant at the Fitzwilliam Museum who had vanished without a trace. The grainy photograph showed the same man from the picture they'd found in Elizabeth's journal. Thomas didn't abandon Elizabeth, Margaret said quietly. He was getting too close to uncovering something bigger than art fraud. Hammond believes he was silenced, and now that Sophie's asking questions, he's afraid history might repeat itself. The morning sun had fully risen now, streaming through the office windows and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. In the distance, a church bell tolled 9 times, marking the hour when Professor Hammond's office hours would begin. But Alexander knew he wouldn't be meeting the professor today. Not until he was certain he could protect Sophie from the shadows that had claimed her father all those years ago. Back at the Blackwood mansion, Sophie sat cross-legged on the study floor, surrounded by her mother's journals. Emily napped peacefully in her bassinet, while Mrs. Harrison organized the entries chronologically, creating a timeline of Elizabeth's discoveries. The morning light caught the silver locket around Sophie's neck, sending small reflections dancing across the leather-bound volumes. "Look at this entry," Sophie said, carefully turning a page dated March 1994. Mother writes about a series of meetings with art dealers in London. She mentions someone called the curator, who seemed to be orchestrating the movement of questionable artwork through various private collections. Mrs. Harrison peered over her shoulder at the elegant handwriting. "I remember those London trips. Mrs. Blackwood always returned looking worried but determined. She'd spend hours in here writing in her journals." Sophie was about to respond when her phone buzzed, a text from Alexander. "Staying with Margaret. Don't leave the house. We'll explain later." She showed the message to Mrs. Harrison, concern creasing her brow. "Perhaps we should take a break," Mrs. Harrison suggested, but Sophie was already shaking her head, her mother's determination evident in her posture. "No, there's something here we're missing." She reached for another journal, this one from late 1994. Mother kept referring to a specific painting, The Garden at Twilight by Friedrich Weber. She believed it was the key to understanding the larger scheme. As if responding to her mother's name, Emily stirred and began to fuss. Sophie lifted her daughter, cradling her close while continuing to study the journal. Mrs. Harrison watched the scene with misty eyes, remembering how Elizabeth used to speak of someday having a family to fill the quiet rooms of the mansion. "Mrs. Harrison," Sophie said suddenly, "did my mother ever mention someone called Thomas Hammond? Not the professor, but his son." The housekeeper's hands stilled in their organizing. "Thomas Hammond, yes, he used to visit the museum when Mrs. Blackwood worked there. A nice young man, very passionate about art history like your mother." She paused, thinking. The professor's son. I hadn't made the connection until now. Sophie's heart raced as she quickly flipped through the journal pages. Mother writes about working with Thomas on tracing the provenance of several paintings. He was helping her investigate the stolen artwork. She found the entry she was looking for and read aloud. "Thomas believes he's found a pattern in the documentation. The same names keep appearing, spanning decades. He's convinced the curator isn't just one person, but a title passed down through generations. We're meeting tomorrow to review his findings. He seems nervous, says we need to be careful who we trust. But this could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for." The next entry was dated 2 weeks later, the handwriting shakier than usual. "Thomas is gone. No one at the museum will talk about it. Professor Hammond looks right through me when we pass in the halls. I have to protect our child now. The truth will have to wait." Mrs. Harrison sat heavily in a nearby chair. "Professor Hammond's son was your father?" Sophie nodded slowly, pieces of the puzzle shifting into place. "And his disappearance wasn't random. He and Mother were getting close to exposing something bigger than just art fraud." She looked down at Emily, sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. "That's why she had to hide me away. She knew whoever was behind it all wouldn't hesitate to use me to keep her quiet." The sound of a car on the gravel driveway made them both turn. Through the study window, they watched as an unfamiliar vehicle pulled up to the house. An elderly man stepped out, his academic air unmistakable even at a distance. "Professor Hammond," Mrs. Harrison whispered, recognizing him from years past. Sophie stood, holding Emily close. "He shouldn't know we're here. Alexander's message said to stay inside." But before they could move away from the window, the professor looked up, his eyes meeting Sophie's directly. The recognition in his gaze was unmistakable. He'd known exactly where to find her. In his hand was a leather portfolio, similar to the ones Elizabeth had used for her research. Mrs. Harrison moved to answer the approaching knock, but Sophie stopped her. "Wait," she said, her mother's cautious nature surfacing. "We need to know why he's here first. Why now after all these years of silence?" Through the study door, they could hear the professor's voice calling out, "Sophie, I know you're there. I have something your father wanted you to have. Something I should have given to Elizabeth years ago, but I was too afraid." Sophie looked down at Emily, then at the journals scattered around the room. physical pieces of the puzzle her mother had left behind. Whatever truth Professor Hammond carried with him would change everything they thought they knew about the past. The question was, were they ready for what that truth might mean for their future? The knock came again, more insistent this time. In her arms, Emily opened her eyes, Elizabeth's eyes, and looked up at her mother with innocent trust. Sophie took a deep breath, making her decision. It was time to open one more door, to face one more piece of her family's complex legacy. But first, she needed to make a call. Alexander needed to know that the very person they'd been planning to seek out had instead come looking for them, carrying what might be the final key to unlocking the mysteries Elizabeth had worked so hard to protect. The study had never felt so small as when Professor Hammond stepped inside, his weathered face a map of grief and regret. Sophie stood near Elizabeth's desk, Emily secure in her arms, while Mrs. Harrison positioned herself protectively nearby. The leather portfolio the professor carried seemed to weigh heavily in his trembling hands. "You look so much like them both," he said softly, his academic demeanor cracking slightly. "Elizabeth's grace, Thomas's determination. I've watched you from afar, visiting Elizabeth's grave, and each time I wanted to approach you, but fear—" He shook his head. "Fear has been my constant companion for 30 years. Sophie's phone buzzed with Alexander's response to her urgent message. "On our way. Margaret says don't let him leave." She slipped the phone into her pocket, focusing on the elderly man before her. "Why now?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "After all this time, why come forward today?" Hammond placed the portfolio on Elizabeth's desk with reverence. "Because yesterday, when you visited the grave with Alexander, I realized Elizabeth's plan had finally come to fruition. She always said the truth would find its way out, like water through stone." He opened the portfolio, revealing documents yellowed with age. "These belong to your father, his research into the art trafficking network that operated through Cambridge's most prestigious institutions." Mrs. Harrison moved closer, her curiosity overwhelming her caution. "Mr. Thomas was looking into stolen art." "More than that," Hammond replied, spreading out the papers. "He discovered that certain families in Cambridge had been protecting a secret for generations. The paintings were just the tip of the iceberg. There were documents, artifacts, evidence of collaborations that would rewrite history books." His hands shook as he withdrew a photograph. "This was taken the day before he disappeared." The image showed Thomas standing in front of a painting, his expression intense as he pointed to something in the corner of the frame. Sophie leaned closer, adjusting Emily in her arms. "The garden at twilight," she read from the painting's placard. "Yes," Hammond nodded. "The painting your mother mentioned repeatedly in her journals. Thomas believed it contained hidden markings, a code that would lead to a cache of documents, proving the extent of the art trafficking network. He was planning to show Elizabeth his findings that night, but—" He trailed off, emotion choking his words. The sound of cars on the gravel announced Alexander and Margaret's arrival. Moments later, they burst into the study, Margaret's usual composure notably ruffled. She stopped short at the sight of Hammond. "James," she said quietly, "I see you've finally found your courage." Hammond met her gaze steadily. "We both have obligations to the dead, Margaret, and to the living." He turned back to Sophie. "Your father wasn't just researching art theft. He discovered that the curator, the title passed down through generations of Cambridge's elite, was responsible for protecting far more dangerous secrets. The stolen art was a smokescreen for something bigger. The documents Elizabeth and I hid," Margaret interjected. "They're being moved because someone realized we're close to finding what Thomas discovered. The paintings are leaving Cambridge, not just to hide their provenance, but to protect what they might reveal." Alexander moved to stand beside Sophie, his protective instinct evident. "What exactly did Thomas find?" Hammond pulled out one final document, a letter written in Thomas's hurried hand. Evidence that certain Cambridge families had been using their positions in academia and society to protect not just stolen art, but historical records that could reshape our understanding of several powerful dynasties. "Your father believed the garden at twilight contained a hidden map to where these records were stored." Sophie felt Emily stir against her shoulder, a small reminder of innocence in the midst of decades-old intrigue. "The painting. Where is it now?" "That's the problem," Margaret said, exchanging glances with Hammond. "It's scheduled to be moved tomorrow, on loan to a private gallery in Switzerland. Once it leaves British soil, We'll lose our chance to find what Thomas discovered, Hammond finished, and with it, any hope of understanding why he vanished and who was truly responsible. Mrs. Harrison, who had been quietly observing, suddenly spoke up. Mrs. Blackwood's last garden party, the one where she locked up the greenhouse. The painting was there, wasn't it? She had borrowed it for the exhibition she curated. Hammond's eyes widened. Yes, and that was the last time anyone examined it closely. After that, it was returned to the college and access was strictly limited. Sophie looked down at Emily, then at the photograph of her father, seeing her own features reflected in his intense gaze. Mother left us the tools to finish what she and my father started, she said quietly. The journals, the hidden documents, the clues in the greenhouse. She knew someday we'd be ready to uncover the truth. Alexander squeezed her shoulder gently. The question is, what do we do with less than 24 hours before the painting leaves Cambridge forever? The answer hung in the air, unspoken but clear to everyone in the room. They had until tomorrow to solve a puzzle that had claimed Thomas's life and shaped Elizabeth's every decision. The truth that had been hidden in plain sight for 3 decades was finally within reach, but time was running out. In her arms, Emily made a small sound, drawing everyone's attention. The baby's eyes, Elizabeth's eyes, seemed to hold a wisdom beyond her months as she gazed at the assembled adults, each carrying a piece of her family's complex legacy. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Elizabeth's study as the group pored over Thomas's research and Elizabeth's journals, searching for connections. Mrs. Harrison had converted the large desk into a makeshift command center, with documents arranged chronologically and cross-referenced with Elizabeth's careful notes. "Look at this," Sophie said, holding up one of her mother's journals. She writes about the garden party where the painting was displayed, positioned the garden at twilight, where the setting sun would illuminate its secrets. The truth lies in the roses, both on canvas and in earth. She looked up, the same phrase she used in her note about the buried journals. Alexander studied the greenhouse key they'd found the previous night. The greenhouse, she locked it up right after that party. What if she saw something in the painting when the light hit it just right? The garden party was in June 1997, Mrs. Harrison recalled, consulting her meticulous records. The sun would have been at its highest point in the sky. The greenhouse's western exposure would have created the perfect lighting conditions in the early evening. Professor Hammond was examining the photograph of Thomas with the painting. He was obsessed with the artist's technique. Friedrich Weber was known for using unusual materials in his paint mixtures, including some that might only be visible under specific lighting conditions. Margaret, who had been quietly reviewing her own files, suddenly straightened. The rose garden. Elizabeth redesigned it that same year. She insisted on planting specific varieties in precise locations. She turned to Mrs. Harrison. "Do you still have the original garden plans?" The housekeeper nodded, hurrying from the room. She returned moments later with a rolled blueprint, yellowed with age. As they spread it across the desk, Sophie gasped softly. The rose garden's design, when viewed from above, created a pattern similar to one visible in the background of Weber's painting. "It's a star chart," Hammond said, his academic excitement breaking through years of caution. Thomas believed Weber had hidden astronomical alignments in his works. The positions of elements in the painting might correspond to specific dates or times. Alexander checked his watch. The sun's position tomorrow evening will be similar to what it was during the garden party. If there's something to see in that painting, we need to see it tonight, Sophie finished, before it's moved. She looked down at Emily, sleeping peacefully in her bassinet. But how? The college's security. Margaret's aristocratic features took on a determined set. "Leave that to me. My family's donations have earned me certain privileges, including after-hours access to the college's art collection. Professor Hammond's presence will ensure academic legitimacy." "I should stay with Emily," Sophie said reluctantly, but Mrs. Harrison stepped forward. "Begging your pardon, but I've cared for 3 generations of children in this house. The little miss will be safe with me." Her voice softened. "Your mother would want you to see this through." Plans came together quickly. Margaret would arrange access to the college for that evening. Hammond would bring his expertise in art analysis, while Alexander insisted on accompanying Sophie, unwilling to let her face this piece of her past alone. As they prepared to leave, Sophie found herself in Elizabeth's study one last time, Emily cradled against her shoulder. The setting sun streamed through the stained glass, creating patterns that reminded her of the rose garden's design. "Your grandmother left us a map," she whispered to her daughter, "and tonight we're going to follow it to the truth she and your grandfather tried to protect." Mrs. Harrison appeared with Emily's favorite blanket. "Best get going, dear. The light won't wait." In the entrance hall, Alexander helped Sophie with her coat while Margaret made final calls to arrange their visit. Professor Hammond stood nervously by the door, clutching his portfolio of Thomas's research. "Elizabeth always said the truth would find its way into the light," Hammond murmured, almost to himself, "like a rose blooming in its own time." As they prepared to leave, Sophie touched the locket at her throat, feeling the weight of 3 generations' secrets. Whatever they discovered tonight would change everything. Not just their understanding of the past, but their path forward as a family. The sun was setting over Cambridge as they drove toward the college, its golden light touching the ancient spires and turning them to flame. Somewhere in those hallowed halls hung a painting that had cost Thomas his future and shaped Elizabeth's every decision. Tonight, in the same light that had illuminated their discoveries 30 years ago, their daughter would finally understand why. Mrs. Harrison stood in the doorway of the Blackwood mansion, holding Emily as the cars disappeared down the drive. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear, their ancient light reaching across time just as Elizabeth's carefully planted clues had reached across the years to guide her daughter home. The truth that had waited so patiently in roses and paint and starlight was finally ready to bloom. The college corridors echoed with their footsteps as Margaret led them through the ancient building. Their path took them past portraits of stern-faced scholars and benefactors, their painted eyes seeming to follow the small group's progress. The security guard who had admitted them maintained a respectful distance, Margaret's authority ensuring their access while minimizing scrutiny. "The painting is housed in the Fellows' Common Room," Professor Hammond whispered, his voice carrying in the hushed atmosphere. "And it's been there since 1965, though few know its true significance." They entered a magnificent room paneled in dark oak, where centuries of academic discourse had shaped the world's understanding of art and history. The garden at twilight hung on the far wall, its placement carefully calculated to protect it from direct sunlight during regular hours. Now, in the deepening dusk, it waited for them like a silent sentinel. Sophie approached the painting slowly, her heart thundering in her chest. The canvas showed a garden at dusk, roses climbing ancient walls, while the sky burned with sunset colors. In the foreground, a partially hidden figure tended to the flowers, their face turned away from the viewer. Thomas believed the artist encoded information in the placement of every element, Hammond explained, consulting his notes. The arrangement of the roses, the angle of the shadows, even the stars beginning to appear in the twilight sky. Everything had meaning. Alexander checked his watch. "We have about 20 minutes before the light reaches the same angle as during Elizabeth's garden party." Margaret stationed herself near the door, keeping watch while maintaining an air of casual authority. "Take your time. We don't want to draw attention by rushing." Sophie studied the painting intensely, her mother's words echoing in her mind. "The truth lies in the roses." She noticed how some of the blooms seemed to catch the light differently, their painted surfaces showing subtle variations in texture. "Professor," she called softly, "do you have a UV light, the kind used for art authentication?" Hammond pulled a small pen light from his pocket. Thomas carried one just like this. He believed certain pigments Weber used might fluoresce under ultraviolet light. As the natural light in the room gradually shifted, Sophie played the UV beam across the canvas. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but then, there, the roses in the foreground began to reveal ghostly lines connecting them in a distinct pattern. "It's a star chart," Alexander breathed, recognizing the configuration from Elizabeth's garden design. "But not of the night sky, it's a map." Hammond's hands trembled as he overlaid a transparent sheet from his portfolio onto the painting. These points correspond exactly with Thomas's notes about the college's old tunnel system, the ones used to protect art treasures during the war. The sun had nearly reached the crucial angle when Sophie noticed something else. A thin line of text, invisible under normal light, began to appear along the painting's lower edge. The words written in Weber's distinctive hand read, "Truth blooms eternal in the garden of time." "The rose garden," Sophie whispered. "Mother redesigned it to mirror this pattern. She wasn't just creating a beautiful space, she was recreating Weber's map in living flowers." Alexander's phone buzzed quietly, a text from Mrs. Harrison. "Emily's fine. The roses are waiting." As if in response, Margaret's cultured voice carried from the doorway. "Security's changing shifts. If we're going to move, it should be now." They carefully photographed the painting under both natural and UV light, Hammond insisting on documenting everything for academic posterity. As they prepared to leave, Sophie touched the canvas gently, thinking of her father standing in this same spot 30 years ago, unraveling the same mystery that had cost him everything. The drive back to the Blackwood estate seemed to take both seconds and hours. The setting sun painted Cambridge's spires in the same colors as Weber's twilight sky, while Sophie's mind raced with possibilities. What had Elizabeth hidden in the rose garden? What truth had been worth protecting for all these years? Mrs. Harrison met them at the door, Emily sleeping peacefully in her arms. "The garden lights are set up as you asked," she said to Alexander. "And I've found something else you should see." In Elizabeth's study, spread across her desk, lay an old gardener's diary. She kept detailed records of every rose she planted, Mrs. Harrison explained, including one variety I've never heard of before, the Twilight Guardian. Sophie took Emily from Mrs. Harrison, drawing strength from her daughter's innocent warmth. Outside, the garden waited in the gathering dusk, its roses holding secrets planted by a mother's love and preserved by time itself. The truth they had chased through art and memory was finally within reach, waiting to bloom in the same light that had revealed its existence 3 decades ago. As they prepared to step into the garden, Sophie felt the weight of her mother's locket against her heart, keeping time with the gentle rhythm of Emily's breathing. The moment of revelation approached on rays of setting sun, promising to illuminate not just the secrets of the past, but the path toward their future. The rose garden glowed in the evening light, each flower touched with gold as the sun approached the exact angle Elizabeth had waited for so many years ago. Alexander and Professor Hammond worked quickly to map the garden's layout against the pattern they'd discovered in the painting, while Margaret consulted the photographs they'd taken at the college. Sophie stood at the garden's center, Emily secure in her arms, turning slowly to take in the full design. From this vantage point, she could see how her mother had used different rose varieties to create subtle variations in height and color, all contributing to a complex pattern that only became apparent in the just right light. "There," Hammond said suddenly, pointing to a section of white roses. "The Twilight Guardians. Elizabeth planted them in a perfect circle, exactly matching the central point in Weber's star chart." Mrs. Harrison appeared with Elizabeth's gardening diary. "According to her notes, those roses were planted last, after everything else was in place. She insisted on doing it herself, even though she was—" The housekeeper paused, glancing at Sophie. "Even though she wasn't well by then." Sophie handed Emily to Mrs. Harrison and knelt beside the white roses. The soil here was different somehow, looser, as if it had been disturbed more recently than the surrounding bed. Acting on instinct, she began to dig carefully around the base of the central bush. Her fingers struck something solid. With trembling hands, she brushed away more soil, revealing a small bronze box similar to the one that had held Elizabeth's journals. This one, however, bore no rose pattern. Instead, its surface was etched with a star chart matching the one in Weber's painting. Alexander knelt beside her, helping to lift the box free. It was sealed with a simple clasp, no lock to keep its secrets safe. Inside, they found a collection of documents, photographs, and a letter addressed to "My dearest Sophie and Alexander." The setting sun reached its perfect angle as Sophie began to read aloud. "If you're reading this, then you've solved the puzzle I left behind. The truth, like these roses, needed time to reach full bloom. The documents in this box prove what Thomas discovered, that certain families in Cambridge had been protecting more than just stolen art. They were hiding evidence of collaborations during the war, connections that reached into the highest levels of society. The paintings were merely the visible part of a deeper deception, but Thomas found something else, something that gave me hope, even in my darkest moments. Among the documents were records of those who fought against this deception from within, brave souls who worked to preserve evidence of the truth and protect those who sought justice. They called themselves the Twilight Guardians, passing their mission down through generations, just as their opponents passed down the title of Curator. Thomas was working with the modern-day Guardians when he disappeared. The evidence he gathered is included here, enough to restore justice to families who lost everything, to reset the balance of power in institutions built on buried truths. I couldn't reveal this while you were growing up, Sophie. The risk was too great. But I knew that someday you would find your way here, to this garden, to this moment. Your father's courage and determination live on in you, just as I hope my love has guided you home. Alexander, my beloved husband, forgive me for keeping these secrets. Know that every moment of joy we shared was real, even when I carried this burden. You gave me the strength to protect what mattered most, our family's future. The Twilight Guardians still exist, working quietly to preserve truth and justice. Margaret can introduce you to them if you choose to continue what your father and I began. But that choice must be yours, made not from obligation to the past, but from hope for the future. The roses will bloom again next spring, and the next, and the next. Each flower a reminder that truth, once planted, cannot be forever buried. Take care of each other. Let love guide your choices as it guided mine. With all my love, through all time, Elizabeth. As Sophie finished reading, the last rays of sun caught the tears on her cheeks, turning them to gold. Emily, still in Mrs. Harrison's arms, reached out toward the roses, a smile lighting her tiny face. Margaret stepped forward, her aristocratic reserve softening. The Guardians would be honored to have you join them, Sophie. But Elizabeth was right. The choice must be yours. Sophie looked at Alexander, who nodded encouragingly, then at Hammond, whose academic passion had been rekindled by their discoveries. Finally, she looked at Emily, who would grow up knowing the full truth of her remarkable heritage. I choose to continue their work, she said quietly, her voice growing stronger. Not just for them, but for Emily, and for all the families who deserve to know the truth about their past. Alexander wrapped an arm around her shoulders as Mrs. Harrison returned Emily to her mother's embrace. The baby immediately reached for the silver locket, now a link between 4 generations of strength and love. The sun had set fully now, but the garden still glowed with an inner light, the light of truth finally freed from shadow, of love passing undimmed through time, of justice blooming at last in the garden of memory. In the growing dusk, the roses Elizabeth had planted stood as silent witnesses to the power of patience, courage, and a mother's endless love. The truth she had protected for so long had finally found its way into the light, carried on the wings of twilight to bloom eternal in the garden of time.